Hello, educators. Today we're diving deep into the world of assessment and feedback. These are crucial elements that help shape how we evaluate and support student learning. Welcome to episode 9 of Cool Cat Teacher Talk, where we have conversations about what matters in education.
Ever wondered how remarkable teaching happens? Find out right now at Cool Cat Teacher Talk with award-winning teacher Vicki Davis. Get insights from top educators, tech tips, and inspiration to elevate your teaching.
In this show, we'll be examining 2 key types of assessment that educators use, formative and summative. These approaches serve different purposes, but work together to create a comprehensive picture of student progress and achievement. If every single assessment in your classroom is going in the gradebook, I would like to suggest you might be making a very big mistake. Formative assessment is an ongoing process that occurs throughout the learning journey. It's like checkpoints on a road trip, helping teachers and students gauge understanding and make adjustments along the way. In contrast, summative assessment is more like reaching the final destination. It evaluates student learning at the end of an instructional unit by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. And sometimes you have intermediate quizzes where you also have a summative assessment to see if students have learned that portion of the content. Also, you'll note we did not discuss mastery-based assessment because this was a topic of a previous Cool Cat Teacher Talk show. You can see at coolcatteacher.com/talk mastery. So join me today as we unpack the power of formative and summative assessments and talk about how we can effectively assess to support and enhance student learning. Let's begin with our first guest, Dr. Samuel Nix. Dr. Samuel Nix is Chief of Schools and author of 6 Steps to a Strong School Culture. Dr. Nix currently serves as the Chief Academic Officer for Duncanville Independent School District in Texas. And as a high school principal, Sam led his campus to be named one of the top 32 urban schools in America by the National Center for Urban School Transformation. And his leadership consistently placed his school in the top 10 within its peer group in Texas. This is Dr. Samuel Nix. His full interview will be aired on an upcoming episode of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. Your views on assessment, formative, summative, and what you kind of like to see in your classrooms in such a large district.
When it comes to assessments, there has to be, or at least as I see it, there should be a shift in how we look at assessing students. Oftentimes, every assessment that we have is tied to a grade. Every assessment that we give a student is tied to pass or fail or 70 or 60, whatever the case may be. And I see that there is a huge gap when it comes to understanding assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment during learning, formative assessment, summative assessment, lag data versus lead data measures. And so part of what we do in our district, and as I do as I work with leaders and teachers, is really help them to understand the importance of and purpose of assessments. So formative assessments, I think, and the question I always ask, and the question I ask in the book is this: why oftentimes is the scoreboard off during practice for any sports?
Oh, because they're practicing, right?
Because they're practicing.
Yeah.
And when we practice, it's okay to fail, because what I'm doing in that practice is I'm honing my skill. When I'm practicing, I'm getting feedback. When I'm practicing, I'm using that feedback to build on my skills. When we're practicing, it's a safe place to mess up and to fall and to whatever, because I'm honing those skills. But what we often tend to do is grade the practice.
Oh.
And so when we fall, when we fail, there's a consequence for everything. And that's the model that we have just grown up in. And so that's the model we continue to use. The other thing to that is when it comes to assessing and or formatively or summatively, we have to assess as much as possible how we play. And so assessments at the level of the standard, assessments aligned to the standard are very critical, but that's what the formative assessments do. And it gives the teacher, it gives the leaders the information that they need to know what type of feedback to give, to know how to support, to know what to do to build that student up in preparation for that summative assessment. Summative assessments shouldn't be a surprise to anyone.
So speaking my language, it's just, I had 2 formative assessments today. I'm teaching binary numbers to my AP Computer Science Principles course. And so I gave them an assessment in a technology tool. And, the first thing they said is it's graded. I'm like, guys, I'm seeing how well I've taught you right now. This is practice. We're practicing to see, because, a test should never be a surprise. I'm always going to know ahead of time, how are my students doing? Because formative assessment is just part of the DNA of the classroom. And, as you talk about this, is so refreshing, because it just seems like, to me, there's a lot of misunderstandings of formative assessment. The first thing that happens a lot of times when I teach teachers how to do formative assessment, they're like, hey, this will give me more grades to put in my grade book. You're like, no, it's not. Please, no.
The other piece to that is this, Vicki, that I'd just like to share for consideration. Just consideration. Think about everything in life that we get feedback on. There is nothing that improves without feedback. I'm going to say that again. Vicki, there is nothing that improves without feedback.
Yes.
Nothing. Our lives are full of feedback. So for an example, get in your car. Your car is designed to do nothing but give you feedback. You look at how often do you look at your gas gauge? How often do you look at your speedometer? How often do you look at whatever it is, right? Your whole dashboard does nothing but give you what?
Feedback.
It gives you feedback because you make adjustments based on the feedback that you're getting in that car. The scale, when you get on, it just gives you feedback. Think everything in life gives you feedback. We make adjustments based on that feedback so that we don't find ourselves on the side of the road asking, why did I run out of gas?
Yeah.
Run out of gas. Right? But if you choose to do nothing with that feedback, if you choose not to take action, if you choose not to take the corrective action, then you're going to find yourself in that situation. I equate that to formative assessment, right? We're constantly, or should be constantly, providing feedback based on what we're learning or what we're seeing so that we and students can make the necessary adjustments to be successful.
As we listen to Dr. Nix, consider his viewpoints on formative and summative assessment and how they should be aligned. Also think about how feedback should be part of everything we do. This is why when my students take a test, once everyone takes the test and I grade it digitally, my students receive an email with feedback on each item on the test. When they have formative assessment, they immediately get feedback. And this is one of the advantages of using technology for formative assessment. Here are 4 tips to improve learning through purposeful assessment. Number 1, give frequent feedback and provide formative feedback every 10 to 15 minutes during instruction. Number 2, have a timely return of assessments. Return quizzes, learning materials, and projects with specific feedback well before the summative assessments. Number 3, make sure your assessments are standards aligned. And remember, one of the best ways to have timely return of assessments is to program it into that app that you'll be using in your classroom. And number 4, give actionable insights. Give specific descriptive feedback that guides student improvement. To see the research for this, go to coolcatteacher.com/talk assessment. Next, we're going to hear from Alan November, who shares a unique method of assessment that specifically incorporates the feedback we have learned about from Dr. Nix. This is Alan November, episode 89 of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. Today we're going to talk about improving our schools with assessment, and we have thought leader Alan November with us today. So Alan, you have an easy idea for how we can improve our assessment. What is it?
I do. The only problem is, Vicki, it's counterintuitive. So I always warn people, don't reject this idea as soon as you hear it. Let it sink for a moment. I first saw this at Harvard, but since then I've seen it in elementary schools and middle and high school. And it was well researched by the Dean of Applied Physics at Harvard, Eric Mazur, who took a semester off to try to figure out how to improve learning. And in Indonesia, he discovered a teacher who, after the kids took their own individual test, the teacher arranged teams, 3, 4, 5 kids in a team, and the team had to take the exact same test again and submit it. And 50% of their grade was their individual test, and the other half was the team test. The professor, the teacher, did not give the students the answers. So the students had to ask each other, what'd you get for number 1? Why'd you get that? And what's fascinating is, compared to a teacher taking home a test and correcting it and bringing it back the next day, if the kid made a mistake already, you just tell them the answer. It doesn't necessarily help the student understand how they get it wrong. And not only that, but a lot of kids who got things wrong are not going to raise their hand in the middle of getting a test back and ask the teacher to explain it again.
Yeah.
Because it was already explained and the kid's too embarrassed to do that.
Yeah.
But as kids talk to each other, there's this explosion of debate. I watched Eric do this at Harvard. As he walks around and he listens to students debate the answers, he learns a lot more than when he corrects individual tests. He learns about the thinking of his students, and he understands that students explain things in ways that are quite different because the first-time learner phenomena, sometimes easier to understand than when he's explained it. And then at the end of that second round, he just gives the class the answers.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have to go over the class test the next day. It saves all that time. And it leads to a lot more learning. In fact, the data at Harvard shows that the results on the final exam, if you did this all year, are significantly higher than educators who do not allow students to take the same test twice.
Wow. Now, the final exam, though, was individual. Did he do the group thing on the final, too?
Final exam's individual.
Wow. I'm intrigued. I mean, it makes total sense. And the thing is, about when going over questions after the test, a lot of kids who didn't get it say, well, they don't understand the cumulative power of what they're learning, that if they don't learn it now, then they're going to not know it forever. And so, but they have a motivation to actually learn it because they want to get it right.
So I just think we have to come to grips with every kid is not motivated equally. All kinds of reasons for that, Vicki. I'm not blaming the kid or the teacher. The reality is that kids are social by nature. They want to talk to their friends. They want to know what their friends are thinking. So it fits into natural behavior. So I'm not going to claim that kids are going to be more motivated, but what I will claim is kids will listen to other kids explain things and question one another the way they might not listen and question a teacher when they go over the test.
So when you saw it at a middle school level, how did it look compared to Harvard?
Yeah, I actually have video of it. We pulled quotes, Vicki. You can hear kids say, well, I know our teacher explained it like this, but I'm going to explain it a different way. Or, all kinds of simple stories that go with the explanation. Kids saying, how did you get that? I still don't understand. Mm-hmm. So you hear them asking more than once, twice, even 3 times, which you would probably never hear that same kid ask a teacher in a classroom 3 times.
Oh, no.
And if the teacher's listening, which any good teacher would do, they get so much insight into learning how their students are thinking that is not represented by answers alone when they correct those tests. I've had teachers just blown away at the reasoning of some of their students who even got the answer correct, but the reasoning is incorrect. Well, Eric Mazur, who further developed this, is just a genius. And he happens to be a friend of mine. So, I get to go over and watch him teach. He's not in K-12. And I'll tell you what else. You start explaining that this is at Harvard, and immediately you can see some teachers push back and say, well, that's great for Harvard kids. I don't have Harvard kids.
Yeah.
But it works even better for kids who are undermotivated.
Oh, yeah, I would think so. And middle schoolers and high schoolers, I mean, So how would a teacher start with this? Let's say they were nervous about starting with a test. I mean, could they start with something a little lower stakes maybe?
I've had lots of teachers adapt this. Some teachers have decided they're going to give a practice test first in a group. Different questions than what's going to be on the individual test, but same content. And the group takes this practice test. And then the next day, after they'd had a chance to think about what they don't know and study some more, they give the individual test. So they reverse it from what Eric does at Harvard. Other teachers, Eric does 50-50 in terms of points. So 50 for the individual score and 50% for the group score. And a lot of teachers, frankly, are uncomfortable with that because they think if you didn't study and you didn't do well and you got an F on the individual and you just rode along with the group for the second test, you could get a C, but you didn't study. So some teachers will do 70-30 or even 80-20 because they don't want to lose control of, frankly, catching kids who haven't studied.
Well, isn't it about what they know, though, when you're done?
Well, Becky, yes, it is. I'm just telling you what I've seen. Becky, I cannot explain all teacher behavior. I've learned not to try. For whatever reason, a lot of teachers are uncomfortable sharing the point spread between the individual and the group.
You know, I guess in some ways I feel like a renegade or a rebel. I just want them to learn it. I'm going to get there ethically, but whatever it takes, I'm just thinking about some of the hardest things I teach and how powerful this would, because I'll tell you this, when you put kids together in groups, it can be difficult to get the stronger kids highly motivated to help the kids who struggle because they kind of feel like, well, that's your job, teacher.
Well, like a good coach, some teachers have told me they put all the A kids together because they'll fight over the last point and they don't worry about helping other kids because they know they're all good students. So I'm going to leave that up to the teacher, how they mix the kids.
Yeah.
What I have learned is you don't want to just let kids pick their own teams.
Right. Oh, totally. Yeah.
You really want to be a good coach and figure out the mix. Mm-hmm. And what Eric does is every month or so, you're on a new team. So by the end of the year, you'd actually worked with everybody in the class at least once on a different team.
I like that.
Yeah, and Eric does one more thing. At the end of the second test, each team has to write an application question, one question. They have to show the answer to their own question, and then that question is sent to another team. So each team gets a question written by another team in the third round. And it turns out this is where Eric learns the most. Usually students write more difficult questions than he did. And he finds out by the design of questions and by listening to who's really designing these questions, what's in kids' imagination. Because asking a good question, frankly, is more difficult than answering a question that's been handed to you. That's a whole skill set.
I fully understand why many of us may not go all in with the exams, but certainly this is a much better option than open book tests and a great option for exam reviews. Here's why. First, instant peer feedback transforms the learning experience as students get immediate reinforcement from their classmates. Next, we have active content engagement as students explain their reasoning and debate answers. They engage with the material on a much deeper level than passive reading. Another significant benefit is anxiety reduction. Research on collaborative testing shows consistent improvements in immediate performance. However, the impact on long-term retention is less clear, with some studies showing benefits and others finding no significant difference. What is certain is that this method enhances the learning experience by promoting active engagement with the material. And finally, this method is a dynamic review alternative. Instead of solitary study sessions or open book tests, collaborative testing turns review into an interactive experience that boosts comprehension and prepares students more effectively. As we look at all the assessment alternatives, collaborative testing is certainly an option we can integrate into our toolkit. Let's talk to Mike Roberts from episode 250 of the 10-Minute Teacher podcast about formative assessment strategies that can help with classroom management. Today we're talking with Mike Roberts, 8th grade English teacher in Salt Lake City, Utah, and author of Hacking Classroom Management, How to Be the Type of Teacher They Make Movies About. Now, Mike, you have 5 ideas for us today to do formative assessment, but these are also strategies that help with classroom management. So give us the first one and help us understand how great formative assessment can help us better manage our classroom.
Yeah, like anything else in our classroom, I think we have to take a variety of approaches in how we do our formative assessments. I think a lot of us fall back on the thumbs up, thumbs down, or the fist to five concept, which, I think is good. But I think the more engaged you can get your students in that process and really get them to think about the learning rather than just respond to it, I think that helps keep classroom management a lot more interactive for the students and a lot more engaging for them throughout the class.
What's the first example?
First example, real easy one. I call them high five hands. On their way out the door, I just have some hands up on my door. And this is a good one for self-assessment. I think a lot of times teachers don't think self-assessment can play a role in formative assessment. And I will sometimes ask students to critique themselves with their effort today, or we'll have a learning target for the day. And I'll say, okay, assess how you did on that learning target today. And there's a green hand, a yellow hand, and a red hand. And they'll just real informally as they walk out, just high five that on the way out. You could also use emojis if you wanted to, put some big old emoji faces up there. And I also sometimes use this as a prior knowledge assessment as they're walking out. If we're going to be talking about irony the next day in my class, I'll say, okay, tomorrow we're going to be talking about irony. Slap your hand up there and let me know what your thoughts are on how you feel about irony. And that way, when they come into class the next day, I have an idea of where the conversation should be going. If I'm seeing a lot of kids slap the red hand, I know, okay, I got to start this, down low. If a lot of kids have already slapped the green hand, though, I know they may have some background on it.
Oh, fantastic. Love it. Okay, what's your second?
That first one was what I call a 1-minute assessment. And now I'm going to go into a couple 5-minute assessments. These are assessments that you can do either as an exit ticket, you can do it as an entry ticket, or you can do it sometime just in the middle of class. I'm a big fan of summarizing and using literacy in the classroom. Two of my favorites are a Twitter summary, where students have to summarize what they have learned in, used to be 140, but now it's 280 characters. And I require them to include a hashtag or two in there. And this is where you really find out which kids get it and which kids don't. Those kids who are nailing their hashtags, it is unbelievable how cool it is when you see that kid really think through what they've learned and come up with this hashtag that just hits it right on the nail.
Can you give me an example of what that would say with a hashtag and how you would know?
We did one on Lord of the Flies a couple years ago, and this kid was really going through, and I had him summarize, I think it was chapter 11, and it's a chapter where a big rock falls on a kid, and their hashtag was #watch for falling rocks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it was really cool to see them think through, and they didn't just go through. They tied something that from their life into the reading, and it was really cool to see something like that play out. The other one that I really like for the little 5-minute assessment is what I call the haiku review, where students summarize or review the learning target for the day in a haiku format. So 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. I know a lot of you are like, my students would not do that. They will, I promise. And it's really fun to see them like counting out syllables. You see them like patting their hand or tapping their jaw. And again, you get these kids who might be quiet or might not be that engaged. And here's their chance to kind of share some of that creativity. And in both of these, I call them a 5-minute assessment, but I always like to have them presented as well. So you might want to add a little 5-minute extra onto the back end of both of those.
Awesome. Okay, what's our fourth?
Then we go into what I call 15-minute assessments. And a big part of classroom management, I think, stems from the fact that students just sit all day long. And they sit in their one class, and they come to the next class, and they sit in that class, and they get a little break here and there, but there's just a lot of sitting. So I'm a big fan of incorporating a lot of movement into my classroom management approach. And so for these quick assessments, I do what's called a walk and talk. Rather than sitting up and having a lecture or even a discussion where they're in small groups and things like that, we will leave the classroom and we'll go walk around the neighborhood. So I will give them a question and they will pair up. And so we'll have a big old line on the sidewalk and we'll start walking. And, you set this up with here are the requirements and here are the parameters and here's your expectations. So they know all this. So I ask that question and then they just start walking, discussing this. And this is a great formative assessment because I'm just kind of hanging out in the middle, walking up and down. And all I'm really listening for with each question are a couple key words. And if they're saying those key words, then I'm feeling pretty confident that they're getting this concept. And walk and talks are great because it gets them out moving. Anytime you can leave the classroom, it's a fun thing for kids, and they really get excited about it. If you're not quite ready to leave your classroom, another one that I would throw in there would be what I call musical chairs. Again, they're in their small groups, but they'll discuss a question, and then I'll play music for about 15 or 20 seconds, and then they'll walk around randomly. And when the music stops, they sit down and then discuss the next question. And again, my role as the teacher in that is I'm just listening for those key words, seeing which kids are really engaged, seeing which kids are passionate about it, which questions I missed the target on. Sometimes I'll ask a question, it'll just be super quiet, so that one falls on me. And then the last one is what I call a vocab story. And again, this one incorporates a little more literacy into it. You know, you're going through your class, you're throwing out some key vocab words, some key concepts, and I'll just write 5 or 6 up on the board. And I'll say, all right, I need you to write me a story incorporating these words into your story. And so for, 10 or 15 minutes, they'll just write a story about whatever they want. And again, you really get to see which kids get it by how they're using those words and how they incorporate those words, whether it's in their everyday lives or in something we're doing in school, how they manipulate the word. You get a really good understanding of, are they getting that concept without, smacking them on the summative assessment. Like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of different ways that we teach. And I think our formative assessments should do something in those same line where, you give that active kid the chance to move. You give that quiet kid that chance to show their artistic talent, and just try to throw out as many different options as possible.
So, Mike, what's one thing you wish that every teacher understood about doing formative assessment right?
That there is no one size fits all. It's a lot like teaching. Like I said, the thumbs up, thumbs down, I think a lot of us fall back on that. Every time I've done a thumbs up, thumbs down, I think it's like 85% give the thumbs up. And I really, as much as I'd like to think I'm that great of a teacher, I don't think, 85% of these kids have this mastered. I think that's just the easy approach. And I think a lot of us like to say, well, look, I did a formative assessment and they said, they were understanding it, rather than letting them show you that they understand it. Rather than taking a passive role in the process, let your students take an active role in the formative assessment process.
And I totally agree with that, because when my formative assessment really started informing my teaching, I did it with binary numbers. Used to, I would do a thumbs up, thumbs down. The kids would say, yeah, I get it or I don't. And I would quickly understand that they totally did not understand. They just wanted to move ahead. They just didn't want to do it anymore because they thought it was too hard. But when I actually started seeing, okay, let's do some problems and let's do a quick formative assessment to actually know what their answer is, then it was like, okay, now we're really getting somewhere. These are some great tips. And I love linking together formative assessment with effective classroom management, because they really do go together. And if you do a formative assessment and your kids aren't engaged in the formative assessment, then you really need to look at everything, don't you?
This advice can help us improve any classroom. But what do we do about assessment when the student and teacher are online? One of the most popular shows I aired during the pandemic was from Dr. Thomas Guskey, Senior Research Scholar at the University of Louisville, as we discussed how educators can adapt our assessment practices for distance and blended learning environments. This is episode 677 of the 10 Minute Teacher Podcast with Dr. Thomas Guskey.
So, Tom, let's talk about assessment and distance learning. Can we even assess in this situation?
That there are two sort of major forces that have always been at work and pressing upon teachers in terms of assessment. The first is the idea of using assessments for feedback and to promote learning. And then the second is the force that is compelling teachers to gather information for the purposes of accountability and grading. And unfortunately, they don't always pull us in the same direction. But I think that the one advantage, and where we've really made significant progress in this time of hardship, has been to recognize we can't do everything and really caused us to focus more specifically on that force that compels us to think about the feedback and learning aspects of assessment. So that allowed us to help teachers understand that assessments that really facilitate learning and help students in this way can be used in very good ways, even when kids are learning from home, that it really changes the distinction between like formative and summative assessments, that we don't have to think of them in those terms anymore. If you're focusing on learning, then any assessment is formative until the students show they got it. And when they show they got it, then we can consider it summative. So I think that this has really, in odd ways, pressed us to be much more responsive to those learning concerns for students. And the results have been pretty positive.
They're positive if the child has access. I mean, I guess it's just such a hard situation. So, Tom, as you look to the future, and we know that options for educators, they're going to have to be blended. So our ideal is we want to be in the classroom with our students, but say we have a period of time that we don't. How does assessment need to level up and improve?
Well, I think that one of the positive aspects that will come from this is we've sort of come to recognize that the assessment accountability issues and the assessment grading issues are not really that important. And we can get by in very good and positive ways by focusing more on the learning aspects of assessment, using assessments as real learning tools, providing lots of flexibility within those, and even giving students some choice. That when teachers turn the situation back on students and say, these are the things that we really want you to learn and be able to do, how can you show me that you have learned this well, and providing students some options. It's opened up all these different venues for students demonstrating the learning outcomes in ways and giving students increased agency in making those kind of decisions. I think we'll carry those forward, and all that will be to, I think, the teacher's advantage and also to students' advantage.
So, Tom, what are your concerns as we move forward of things you don't want to see happen?
Well, one of my most important issues that I keep stressing in these webinars and Zoom sessions and Skype sessions that we've been considering is to recognize that we need to make assessments for the purposes of accountability and grading easier for teachers. We need to lessen these distinctions that teachers have to make. I mean, for example, many of the schools have gone to limiting the number of cutoffs and grade categories that teachers have to make, where in many schools they're going to like a successful completion versus incomplete and causing only one distinction to be made, or maybe three categories of you got it, this was really outstanding, and then you still need some more time with this. Up to letter grades, where we have 5 or possibly 4 distinctions. But it's also helped us recognize that a percentage grade system, where there are 100 different categories of performance, 100 different cutoffs that teachers have to establish, become very difficult for teachers to make. And I think with that recognition, we're moving in positive ways to say we need to get rid of stuff like percentage grades and move to categories that are more defensible, far more reliable for teachers to use, and then communicate adequately in good, positive ways to students what they're doing well, where they need to make some changes, and our confidence that they can learn these things really well.
Well, assessment is such a challenge, and having conversations about assessment is important as schools need to change. How do you recommend, as we go into the summer, that superintendents and principals facilitate conversations on effective assessment and what it does look like in the fall? Is there sort of a best practice for moving a school forward in positive, better, improved assessment?
I think so. I think that what I've been encouraging school leaders to think about is to engage all of their staff members in thoughtful conversations about really the purpose of the assessment. And if we establish that our purpose of assessment is to really facilitate learning, that we want assessments to be learning tools, that we want to use it in positive ways to provide students with feedback on their learning so that they can take these assessment feedback and use it in ways to say, this is what I know, this is what I'm able to do.
Dr. Guskey's insights are valuable, but implementing these changes may require shifts in how we think. So as we rethink assessments, let's look at 4 things. First, we need to shift our focus from mere accountability to enhancing student learning. And second, assessments can be feedback tools. So how are you adding feedback and answer explanations to the tools you're using to assess students? Third, do you have options to provide flexibility and student choice? If the primary method of assessment is always pen and paper, perhaps your school can discuss other alternatives for assessing students. And finally, engage your team in purposeful assessment discussions, specifically targeting areas where your school is not meeting standards or has room for improvement. so you can create a more equitable, learning-focused assessment system that benefits teachers and students in the many types of learning environments we use today. I also want to note that much of the feedback capabilities as part of assessments are through the use of technology, and we still continue to have technology access issues in many schools today. Formative Assessment in Kindergarten, episode 398.
Today we're talking with Becky Holden, an early education math teacher from Atlanta. So Becky, today we're talking about formative assessment in kindergarten. So what does formative assessment look like in kindergarten?
What we do is we think about what a rich task would be for kids to do. And then we think about that conceptual trajectory that we might see during the lesson and what we anticipate that kids might do. And then the formative assessment comes because we think ahead about what we're going to notice and note. And those are the notes. And they got our questions during the lesson. And then they help us plan for next steps after that lesson's over.
Okay, so give me an example of what this has looked like recently.
So let's say that, like, we introduced in a kindergarten class, Rec and Recs.
Wait, now what was that? What did you say?
Rec and Rec.
What is that?
Those are beads on wire. So you might have seen them ages ago, and there were maybe 10 beads on a wire, and there were like 10 rows of beads. And you count with them. So what we do actually is we have 2 rows, and there are 10 beads on each row, and there are 5 red beads and 5 white beads on each row. So you can use them to count and to solve math problems. So what we wanted to introduce them as a tool for would be to think about this story, 7 little rabbits walking down the road. And as they get tired, one by one, they go down to Mole's house. So there's 7 rabbits walking down the road. That's 7 beads on the top row of the Rec and Rec. And then after a while, when a rabbit gets tired, one of them goes down to Mole's house. So then that means 6 beads would be on the top and 1 bead would be on the bottom. So it's really cool because then it gets to be, there are always 7, and then they get to see how it was 7 and 0, and then it was 6 and 1 and 5 and 2, and notice those kinds of, what happens as the story continues and how the number at the top becomes less by 1 and the number at the bottom becomes greater by 1. And so we plan it to connect with a storybook, and we act it out with stuffed animals, and it's so sweet. And then we use the Rec and Rec. So to anticipate before the lesson starts, we wonder, as kids are going to use the Rec and Rec to represent the story, are they going to need to slide all the beads back to the start position and then start over and say, now there's going to be 6 on the top and 1 on the bottom? Or are they going to have that 7 on the top and 0 on the bottom and just understand that they're going to slide 1 back on the top and slide 1 over on the bottom? Do they get that relationship between, like, if I take 1 off on the top, does that mean that I can slide 1 over on the bottom and still have 7 beads in play? So that's an example. And then if you say, so how many do you have on the top? Do they have to count them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1 on the bottom? Or there's 5 red and 5 white. So can they say, I know there's 7 on the top because I have 5 red and 2 white, and that's 7. Or that's 5, 6, 7. When we anticipate all those kinds of things, that's formative assessment, because we can see, do they supersize? Can they count on? Do they have to count all? Do they understand that relationship between changing the top row to the bottom row? Do they have to start over fresh each time and just show that next part of the story, by starting at 0 and then sliding over what they need? All those pieces help us think about how they see numbers, and those are anticipations that we make notes about, and that's formative assessment.
Yes, because we're trying to understand how is knowledge forming in their mind, because they may get the right answer, but there may be some thinking that is a little off, that needs to be instructed. Would you agree?
Yes, but also it helps us know where to nudge them next. Because if they start fresh, then we would, and if they start over each time, then that kind of tells us where we step in to get them to go to the next part. Or if they have to recount each time to tell you how many are on the top and on the bottom, could we say, well, let me see, you already know that's how many? 5. Could you say there's 5 and then say one more is 6 and one more is 7? I mean, it's not just the right and wrong answer. It's where are they on their path to get the right answer so that we know what that next question is going to be for that particular student.
So you're constantly working the room, you're constantly moving around, you're constantly talking to students about their representation of the numbers. Is that right?
Yes. It's not just I'm looking to see that you have what I hope you have on your Rec and Rec. It's that I'm curious to know how you made that happen and how do you know how many there are now? Because those are pieces that help me know what your next steps are.
Now, how do you have time to do this? Is this you and the teacher, or is this you just by yourself with the students, or how do you work the classroom so that you don't have, one person, playing with a lampshade and you know how kindergartners are.
I do. That's a great question. Well, one thing that we do a lot, and it's not always possible, but sometimes, like with that Rec and Rec intro, everybody's sitting on the rug in a circle. So we can check in with a few at a time while they're all accomplishing the task, but then we always make sure that there's some time at the end where they can use it as a tool to make their own choices about what to do. And that's another opportunity that we can use to check in with kids and say, so can you show me that part of the story where it was, 6 walking down the road and one was taking a nap? And can you show me on the Rec and Rec? And then what happened next in the story? And, so you can still check in with more kids. So that's one way. And we have lots of different ways teachers are practicing remembering what they see. So we might have Post-its. There are different ways teachers are comfortable doing it. They might just draw boxes on a piece of paper and say, I want to notice, do they start over? Can they move the beads? Do they count them all? Do they count on? And then if you see somebody do one of those things, you just write their name in the box. I mean, it will just be as quick as that. So you might not be able to check everybody on everything that time, but you have this ongoing recording sheet that can help you see what you have learned about that particular student. And even if you don't get to everybody that time, you still get a feel for how to plan for the next experience that you're going to have with those with that class, so you can plan your next lesson and then go back and check in with kids you may not have seen. Or you could have workstations the next day because you've already, like with the Rec and Recs, once we've introduced them, then they can have a small group station, and have some independent stations and some that, where you are asking a particular task of them, and then you can check in with them and add to your notes. So there's lots of ways to get to everybody eventually.
We can't talk about assessments without talking about high-stakes testing. A real-world example with teacher Christie Thompson, an award-winning educator. She will share her experience helping students prepare for the STAR test in Texas. This is Christie Thompson, episode 628 of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast.
So tell me about the first experience you had with a student where you were like, you know what, I'm really proud of this student.
When I was teaching middle school, I had some 8th graders, and in Texas, you have to pass a test called the STAR test in order to be promoted to high school. And so I had some students who came in who had never passed the STAR test ever. And so when they came with me, they worked really hard. They sat at teacher table almost every day. They came to tutoring. They did everything, and they were able to pass that test. And so I was very proud of the effort that they put forth and all of their hard work. And so I was super proud of those students. And I've had so many of them. I think of one student in particular.
So what made you so proud about him?
Because he worked hard. He humbled himself because he was a star athlete, and he was able to just humble himself, admit that he needed help with reading, admit that he couldn't do it on his own. Sometimes, sitting at the teacher table could be ostracized, where you're always sitting here, you're always being called to sit with the teacher and go over your test. He endured several failures as far as tests. Whenever we would take tests, he struggled. And so he would have to come and do corrections with me so that we can talk things out. And so he was able to humble himself, and he was able to work hard. And he even came after school or before school, sometimes even at lunch, to get extra help. So I was proud of him. And then when we found out the results that he passed, he cried.
Wow.
And so did I, because he had never passed that test before. Because they take it in Texas. They start in third grade, and they take it third, fourth, fifth, sixth. They take it every year after third grade. And he had never passed.
Wow. So take us to the conversation of how you would talk to him to help him know that he could do it.
Well, I met him where he was. He did have a 504 plan. So he had ADHD, but I would just tell him, hey, you can do this. I see that you're able to identify these plot elements. Now I need you to take it a step further and analyze why the author chose to do this. You know that this is the climax. You know that this is the setting. Why did the author choose this setting? What is the mood that this setting is creating? And just encouraging him by meeting him where he was so that he could see, okay, I'm at step one, and then scaffolding him so that he could see that it's not that hard if I just take it one step at a time. I would always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so just take this test, take everything that you do one step at a time, and realize that you got this. And so I just gave him a lot of encouragement, and then I always met him where he was. And whenever we reached one goal, we just step up and go to the next one after that.
Take us back, Christie, to the moment when you saw each other the first time after you found out and he found out that he had passed the test. What happened?
Well, we get the results before the student, just literally right before the students. And so I had my list. And so everybody in that class actually had passed. And so I was sitting at the table and I had them working, and I had them come up one at a time. And I would go over their results, show them their results. And the way we would do it is if we had students who had failed, we called them prior to. So they knew in advance. We didn't shock students that day. But I was very blessed that class, everybody had passed. So I was able to call them up and go over their results. I said, all right, I'm just going to call him John. John, come on up. So he kind of stood there and kind of looked funny. And he said, failed, didn't I? I said, well, come look at it. And so he came and he looked at it and he said, oh, is that passing score? Because there are numbers and doesn't necessarily, it's kind of hard to see. And I said, yes, you passed. And you also met a performance standard, like you increased your goal, like you have met a goal. A progress measure is what it's called. And then he just looked at me and his eyes got red and he started watering and I started watering and I said, you did it. You did this. And he said, thank you so much. You just don't know. I never passed this test before. And to this day, whenever I see him, because he's a senior in high school now and he's graduating, he has a college football scholarship. And whenever I see him, he runs up to me and he gives me a hug and he tells everybody, this is the best teacher. This is the best teacher right here. I never passed that test before. This is the best teacher.
This story reminds us of the human element in assessment and the impact dedicated educators can have. But now I'm going to share an excerpt from episode 841 of the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, where I shared how I create and use a custom GPT to give formative feedback in my classroom. You can see the accompanying video for this at today's show notes at coolcatteacher.com/talk assessment. When I am introducing this formative assessment tool in my classroom, I tell my students it's just that. I say, I have created an app using ChatGPT to give you feedback on this website project. They are using my phone with the custom GPT loaded, and that I tell the students at the end of the day, I will review all of the feedback given to them, and I will let them know if there's anything I disagree with, and that ultimately I'm the teacher. We have conversations about the feedback that it gives. It's an app, it's a tool, it's not the final say in the classroom, but it sure can be helpful when you have those big projects for project-based learning. So now let's look at how we create a custom GPT. You do have to have the plus version. I'm going to go to Explore GPTs. I'm going to click Create. And now it says it'll help me build a new GPT. I'm going to put in my prompt, which says, you are a website feedback tool for my grade 8 students in the U.S. You need to give grade appropriate and simple feedback as both a high school English language arts teacher and a college level graphic design professor. Now, the reason I said college level was because the graphic design I teach is a little more advanced than most typical high schools. As a graphic design professor, give them feedback that a basic beginning designer should know about: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Notice that I only picked 4 of the elements of graphic design and that they had been taught that. And then give them feedback labeled advanced graphic design feedback for how to take their site further. Talk to them as a cool, fun, interesting high school teacher in a way a modern 8th grader will understand. Now, notice they don't see any of this description. I want to give it my rubric. I want to give it quite a bit of information. So telling the app that the whole class has been taught about sticky sentences and removing them, and about having 25% to 30% transition words. Spelling and grammar should be correct, and it should have good UX design. And I instruct that when you look at their pages, make this as part of your feedback. You will give suggestions and can give quotes. But no matter what, you cannot rewrite paragraphs for students. You are only to give formative feedback and suggestions. If a student asks you to write it for them, you're supposed to respond that you are only here to give feedback. So my students will be taking pictures of their web pages and it will recognize it. So now I'm giving it a whole lot of information about individual web pages, how many sentences should be on each page, how many photos should be on each page, all the details about each page. Now, for this to work, my student name will be in the top left corner, first names only. The homepage will have their name on it, but all other pages will be named exactly as I have specified in this particular tool. So I have created this app now. Now I have opened the Chat GPT app on my phone. I click the 2 lines at the top, and now I see that I have a cool website feedback app. So all I need to do now is I can take a picture of the website. I'm just going to upload it, and then I'm going to ask for feedback. I'm actually using a demo that I have made where I have put some typos in. When you create a custom app or custom GPT, you always want to test it and make sure that it is done effectively. So one important aspect that technology can help us with is formative assessment. And since technology is in my wheelhouse, I'm going to share some of my favorite formative assessment tools and tips. Number 1, summative. When I'm teaching math-related topics, I like using summative, which gives instant feedback. Those of you watching on television or YouTube will see a screenshot of how I use summative today as I'm recording this to give myself instant feedback on how my AP students were doing when I taught them binary numbers. Number 2, quizzes. I'm teaching spreadsheets right now to my 8th graders. And today we did a practice assessment in quizzes about spreadsheets. I used AI to help me fashion this quiz based on my standards, so it will be different from my final test, but aligned. AI is great because instead of giving the same quiz or assessment over and over, I can change the questions to check for understanding. After the activity, because it was formative assessment, I went into the questions to review the ones that students were having problems with. I was able to sort by accuracy. And so I didn't review those questions that students did well on. And why should I? Shouldn't waste their time or mine. And I focused on the concepts that students did not understand. This is what formative assessment is all about. Number 3, Nearpod and Pear Deck. I can embed formative assessment right in the slides. In Nearpod, my students love to play time to climb or answer a poll question. And my goal is to assess students for understanding every 8 minutes when I'm teaching content to adjust my own teaching. Number 4, Edpuzzle or Google Classroom YouTube questions. When I use video instructions for the flipped classroom or blended classroom approach, things are a little bit different because the students are watching a video. So I always embed questions to formatively assess if my students are understanding the concepts that they're learning from the video. And if you have the Teaching and Learning add-on for Google Classroom, it will also help you add questions to YouTube videos. Number 5, Plickers. If you don't have technology in the classroom, you can use your phone or computer's camera to see where students are by printing out one-page Plicker sheets for each student. Then, when you ask questions in your slides, students can hold up their Plicker in the direction of how they want to answer. And with a quick scan of the room with your camera, you'll know exactly how your students are doing with the content you're teaching. So you don't have to have every single student having technology in order to use powerful formative assessment. I'd also like to mention the book Small Teaching by James Lang, as he has a powerful method of assessment where he asks 5 questions at the beginning of class relating to the topic for the day. It's not for a grade, but it helps students know what will be important that day. He did this in a college classroom and the results are astounding. And when I adopted this for my AP Computer Science Principles classroom last year, I believe that my experiment with this technique was a big reason that my students did so well on the test. As we finish up today's show, remember that slow, steady improvement is the only method of improvement that works. That's why I talk about innovating like a turtle. And my teachers at my school always say, I can turtle, can't I? And we all can. We can all be humble and admit that we can improve in assessment. Make sure that we quickly provide feedback to students through formative assessment or quizzes, and that those align with our final assessments we'll be giving. Create tracking mechanisms to keep up with where you are on your assessments and your feedback. And innovate like a turtle and find one new technology that is available in your school so you can assess formatively in a different way. Also remember that when we have state or formal assessments, that we have a whole other set of challenges. And sometimes we have to lean on other resources that we did not create. But we can be there with students for emotional support and work hard to help them achieve and perform. Take time to discuss assessments in your school and observe teachers who are great at formative and summative assessments. And let's work to help our children master the standards while emphasizing the importance of positive relationships with children as we work to help them learn. Also, you'll note we did not discuss mastery-based assessment because this was a topic of a previous Cool Cat Teacher Talk show. You can see at coolcatteacher.com/Talk Mastery. Thank you for listening to episode 9 of Cool Cat Teacher Talk. We've been talking about assessment. You can find the show notes and subscribe to my newsletter at coolcatteacher.com/Talk Assessment. You can listen to past episodes of Cool Cat Teacher Talk on YouTube at Cool Cat Teacher. And you can find the podcast, the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Stay in the loop. Visit coolcatteacher.com, everywhere you connect. See you later, educators.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to what matters in the classroom. This is Cool Cat Teacher Talk.